here we are again with our next video for you in the series about SEND support. And this was going to link on from the last video we did, which was all about one planning. So I'm here with Terry again. Hi, Terry.
Hi, Sue.
So today we're going to think then about what happens if you have had these 3 cycles of one planning that we described in the last video with assess, plan, do, review. You've had those 3 cycles and you've had 3 one plans, and the child is still failing to make adequate progress or failing to thrive. Terry, what would the next steps be?
Okay, so the one plan document should be being reviewed at least termly, and during these one plan meetings you would have looked at what's working, what's not working, and what needs changing. For example, what difference has the interventions that your child received, what difference has that made? Does the support need changing, increasing, etc.? If at the review stage it's identified that your child is not making progress, you should be having a discussion with your child's teacher or the school SENCO, which is Special Educational Needs Coordinator, as to whether more support needs to be put into place. Whether they need to seek support advice from their inclusion team, seek support advice from other professionals, or if a request for an education, health and care needs assessment needs to be made.
Right, so here we're now talking about what if we're going down this route of making a request for an education, health and care needs assessment, which is the first step, right, towards getting an education, health and care plan. So the idea is that if these 3 cycles of one planning have happened and your child is still failing to make progress, maybe what's needed is a thorough review of the child's needs, because you need that in order to be able to say what provision is going to be needed. So the first step towards an EHCP is requesting the needs assessment. So Terry, when should you apply for an education, health and care needs assessment, and who should apply for that?
If the child is not making expected progress with SEND support at the one planning stage, or that the child is only making progress due to the high level of provision being in place that is over the resources available to schools, that's a £6,000, 13 hours of support, then the next step would be to request an education, health and care needs assessment with a view to securing an EHCP, which is an education, health and care plan. This will ensure the child's needs are fully identified and provision is in place to meet those needs. To support your application, you will be able to evidence from previous one planning that the provision in place to meet your child's special educational needs has not helped them to make expected progress, or that they're only making expected progress due to a high level of support in place and above that available to a school.
Right, so what we're saying there is that if so the schools are allocated the equivalent of around £6,000 a year or 13 hours per week support for the child. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So if that amount of resources has been allocated to the child and the school is having to provide more than that, and that's what's meaning that the child is making progress, that is also a threshold for thinking about going to apply for a needs assessment, or if the child has had those stages of one planning and then still not making progress, then to apply. So is it the school that applies for that, Terry?
No, so either the school can make that request or a parent. I think what I also need to make clear at this point is that the level of support that I've just mentioned, the £6,000 and the 13 hours of support, it is not ring fenced, meaning that schools do not have to spend that money in a specific way. So schools can choose how they spend that money. That could go towards learning support assistant staff, that could go towards a safe space that's manned by adults. So schools can really decide how they'd like to spend that level of money. But what is important is that your child's needs are being met.
Yeah, that's a really good point to make, because I think I have heard sometimes when I've been speaking to parents, them going back to schools and saying, well, I need to have a breakdown of how you spent the £6,000 on my child. But actually what they might do is say, well, in this particular class here, we've got maybe 3 or 4 children who need SEND support, and we can pull the money that we get allocated in order to buy in pay for another member of support staff. So schools could be quite creative and flexible in how they use that money. So that's not something that any parent is going to get a specific breakdown about. But I was just wondering, Terry, could you say a little bit more about the criteria that the local authority apply in making a decision about whether they will do an assessment or whether they won't do an assessment?
If a local authority is requested to carry out an education, health and care needs assessment by a parent, young person, school or college, they must consider the following. A, whether the child or young person has or may have special educational needs, and B, whether they may need special educational provision to be made through an education, health and care plan. If the answers to both of these questions is yes, they must carry out an education, health and care needs assessment.
Okay, so we have quite a lot of families that get back to us saying their assessment has been turned down for whatever reason. So it's a good idea. It's really good for parents to have that information so that they can maybe go back and get some information from the local authority. If the answer is no, they won't undertake a needs assessment, to get some information about why, so that you can, as a parent, look at that. So say that the local authority say, yeah, okay, we are going to undertake the education healthcare needs assessment. What happens next, Terry?
The local authority must tell you within 6 weeks of your request if they will be undertaking an assessment of your child's education, health and care needs. If the local authority agrees to assess, the local authority must seek advice from a range of people, including the child's parent or the young person, educational advice, and that would normally be from the head teacher of the school or Senko, medical advice and information from a healthcare professional, psychological advice and information from an educational psychologist, advice and information in relation to social care, advice and information from any other person the local authority thinks appropriate. Where the child or young person is in or beyond year 9, advice and information in relation to provision to assist the child or young person in preparation for adulthood and independent living. Also, advice and information from any other person the child's parent or young person reasonably requests that the local authority seek advice from. The local authority is legally required to seek all of this information as a minimum. If the local authority refuses to assess, the parent or young person over 16 years of age can either accept the decision if they agree with the local authority's decision. They can either ask for a way forward meeting, a mediation meeting to discuss this, their decision further. This information will be found on the formal letter that the local authority send you to explain that they're refusing to assess your child's education, health and care needs. Or you can appeal to the first tier tribunal against the local authority's decision to refuse to assess. You only have 2 months from the date of correspondence that the local authority have refused to assess, or 1 month from mediation to lodge your appeal.
Okay, so there's lots of information in there, Terry, and hopefully that's useful for people to know what steps you can take if you get a no. Useful information about what advice and guidance the local authority have to seek in making the assessment. So they have 6 weeks to tell you whether they will or won't assess. And once they say, yes, we're going to assess, how long do they then have to undertake that assessment, Terry?
Okay, so the whole assessment should be completed within 20 weeks. So that allows the 6 weeks for when they tell you whether they're going to make the decision, whether they're going to assess your child's education, health and care needs, right up to the point of when the final EHCP plan is issued to you. The whole process should be completed within 20 weeks.
So that's 20 weeks from the date that they receive your request, or 20 weeks from the date that you receive their letter?
No, 20 weeks from the date that you they receive your request.
Okay, so that's useful information to know as well, isn't it? To keep that information there. And then obviously, once the assessment has happened, we then go into the whole EHCP process of getting that drawn up and looking at the draft assessment. And there's so much information in that one. That's probably going to be our next video, Terry, isn't it? Around what happens around getting a draft EHCP, agreeing it, and then agreeing school placement. So we'll come to that next. But I just wondered, just to finish off this video, Terry, Have you got any general advice for families who maybe are going down this route, knowing the process is the way you do, and supporting all the families that you do? If you could give one bit of advice for families, what would it be?
So if there's one bit of advice that I could offer families, that would be to keep a diary and to log key information in that diary. So that could be information of when you've been into school for meetings, whether there's been key information shared to you either by your child's class teacher, the school SENCO, health professionals, or maybe an educational psychologist that your child has seen. But I think what's really important is, as parents, we can become exhausted. We can become reactive to things that are happening on a daily basis, and then being able to retain the information that happens on a daily basis can be quite difficult to then recall that information. So my advice would be to keep a diary and to log all the key information so that you have one place to recall that information as and when you need it.
That's brilliant advice, Terry. And also, of course, if you're going down the route of asking for an EHC needs assessment and applying for an EHCP, to note down all the timescales, because what you know now is that you've got that 20 weeks. So that's fantastic information, as always, Terry. And we'll speak again soon, shall we? And we'll talk about EHCPs next time.